So I'm going to actually give a talk that I originally gave last year at the Wildlife Society conference with some, a little bit more insight into sort of how I'm feeling the way citizens and scientists are interacting after having gone to some workshops and working with more on the scientist side of things, as well as with a new citizen science enterprise, the eButterfly enterprise, which is modeled after eBird, of course, and just trying to engage people in general as observers and citizen scientists. And what we're finding is sort of some conflict between citizens and science, and how to sort of resolve that as you're building these programs. I'm going to sort of just talk about two things, and this is again right out of my talk last year. My work on analyzing checklists, particularly butterflies, but other species can be observed as checklists, and this is one of the most common ways that citizens engage. They just write down things in their notebook, and they have a list of things that they saw that day, and then we'd like to know, the scientists would like to know where they saw them and how long you spent, and we can then use that data to make inferences about how things are changing in the environment. I'm awfully close already. Yeah, I would have to have it in my mouth to be closer. So I'll just try to talk louder. I don't talk very loud, and I'm a little bit of a stutterer. So, so the last talk sort of mentioned three models of citizen scientists: the contributory, collaborative, and co-created. And I think there's one of the things that sort of the citizen science movement came out of is something a little different from all these three, in my opinion. This is sort of the Audubon Society model, where there was nothing there in the beginning. There wasn't a lot of scientific involvement. It was purely citizens who had a common interest in looking at birds. And they did this for years and years and years. And like 75 years after they started that, the scientists sort of started thinking like, oh, this might be really useful data. And that's sort of the beginning of what I see as the citizen science movement. And similarly, NABA started in the 70s, this is the North American Butterfly Association, in the 70s, and very much modeled after the Audubon Society's Christmas bird counts. They did July 4th bird counts because there's not a lot of butterflies at Christmas time. But similarly, after 20 or 30 years of that, then there was sort of an engagement by the scientists who realized that this might be a really excellent data source for understanding particularly things like climate change, but other human impacts and perhaps non-human impacts that might be causing bird and insect communities to change. And so what we're finding at this point is there's this sort of, one of the problems that happened when this initial sort of co-creation or collaboration started, when the scientists started to engage these citizen groups, is that they weren't necessarily happy with the data. It wasn't perfect data. There was effort control issues. And so there was a lot of initial excitement and then some disappointment because the data just weren't as useful as people maybe had thought they were. And so what happened after that was the scientists started trying to they tried to engage citizens to do very specific sort of robust protocols. And this is still happening today, and that's a good thing. But what I'm finding when we try to engage these enthusiast groups, these sort of people with their own agency that want to go out and make observations, is that you can't ask them to do too much, or you sort of switch them off. And so if you have a bunch of people that have on their own decided to go out and make observations on butterflies or birds, and they have been doing this for years and years, just doing this really diligent thing where they write down all the butterflies and birds they saw when they walked their dog every Saturday afternoon. When you suddenly come to them and say, I have, this is great, but I would like you to do these other three transects for me, that tells them two things. Implicitly, it says that what you're doing this past 20 years actually isn't very good, which turns them off. And it also suggests that this thing that is better, I really don't have time for. And so the result is they don't actually do anything in terms of making those reports. So the real trick here at the interface of these groups that really have their own agency, like NABA and Audubon, is to give them just enough direction to make the data useful for you, but not so much that they're turned off by how much work you're asking of them. And the checklist thing that most of these citizen scientist people do is actually perfect, because they are doing it anyway. They have their own agency. They're going to go write this stuff down. It's either going to stay in their notebook if you turn them off, or they're going to report it through an online portal if you have them engaged. But you can't take away their agency. So one of the things that I've been working on then is trying to deal with these imperfect kinds of data that you can actually get people to collect in large numbers. And this is the real power of citizen science, isn't that you can get volunteers to go out and do these protocols for you. It's that you can get 1 million volunteers to go out and make observations that might not be perfect, but in that 1 million people, with some really simple statistical fixes, you can get really strong signals of what's happening in the environment. So I'm going to talk about one club that I worked with, the Massachusetts Butterfly Club, that had been doing this on their own with really no scientific direction for 20 years. They started in 1992. They were technically a member of the of NABA, the North American Butterfly Association, but they really acted totally autonomously in terms of how they collected and maintained their own data. And they did this by setting up a list server where they could just communicate with each other about what butterflies they were seeing through time. Then they very quickly actually engaged a core group of about 50 people that just made these regular observations. They had no scientific oversight at all, but they did this one really intelligent thing that made them different from almost every other citizen science group or sort of natural history enthusiast group in the country at the time, is that somehow they realized that they had to put the stuff in a proper, in an actual database, a proper relational database. And I don't know how they decided to do this, but they did it properly, and we were really at great benefit because they had taken that insight to have someone take all these notes that they've made and put it into a computer database. So when I got the data, when I was looking at Hubbard Forest, we did some really simple things right away, and we could see that there were really strong trends. This is just raw data from observations, and the size of the bubble is the number of individuals of this butterfly seen on a particular outing by one of the group members, and it's log scaled. So in the early 90s, it was not unusual to see, a couple of hundred or even 500 Atlantis fritillaries in an afternoon in the Berkshires of western Massachusetts. Whereas by the end of the 2000s, it was more typical to see one or two or none at all. Very rarely. I should say that the color of these dots is just offset so that you can see what they overlap. It's all the same. The size of the dot is the scale. So we wanted to actually take this data, and there are many species where the trends are more subtle, and use a proper statistical regression model to estimate the detectability and the change of the detectability in these butterflies through time. And we just used a simple, straightforward logistic regression, which is a very sort of classic approach for understanding changes in probability through time. And in our case, we were looking at the change in the probability of a detection on any outing by a member of the Massachusetts Butterfly Club. Now, one of the things that most of these citizen science advocacy groups are not very good at is writing down their effort. And this is one of the biggest things that scientists engaging citizens are having to grapple with. They're perfectly happy to write stuff down, but they're less good about writing down how long they spent doing that activity. So you don't really know how hard they looked or how often they looked. You just know that they saw this thing on Thursday and it was maybe sunny that day. And perhaps the thing that they also, so the only other ancillary information we have with respect to if they saw a monarch on that day was they also saw all these other butterflies that day, while they didn't see anything else that day. And we can actually use that as a proxy for effort. If we look at the length of the list, and it turns out that, so we just add one parameter to the model, which is the alpha-2 parameter here, or the A2 parameter, and that explains a huge amount of the effort, and it controls for effort very well, so that we can then estimate the A3 parameter, which is the change in detectability through time, which is a proxy for change in abundance. And so we can do this for all the species in Massachusetts, minus a few that we had some difficulties with, or there were changes in taxonomic or reporting, taxonomy or reporting. And we can look at the A3 parameter on a line and just rank the species. And what I want you to focus on here is the line across the middle, this all a horizontal line, is the line where there's no population change. So there's things at the far right of this, on the far right of this graph are increasing quite rapidly. Things on the far left are actually decreasing quite rapidly. And again, this is just from people going out and making these lists on a Sunday afternoon of their own accord. So once we had this, we could do some more scientific tests. We could look at this more rigorously. And one of the things that we wanted to understand was, were there traits of these species that were causing things to be over on the right side of this graph, increasing, or over on the left, and decreasing? And the simple thing that you could do was just look at the position of Massachusetts. All these records were made in the state of Massachusetts. And look at its position relative to the historically reported ranges from just field guides, as well as some other reports that were a little more sophisticated. So, for example, the Harris checker spot here has a northerly range with respect to the state of Massachusetts, and the spicebush swallowtail has a southerly range. And we can just code the graph with these colors, where blue is our species that are on the northern, that have a northern range with respect to Massachusetts, and red is a southerly range. And what you see is very clear signal of decline in species in the state of Massachusetts that have historically had ranges that were more northerly, but included the state of Massachusetts. And this group of butterflies on the far right, which all have had historically southerly ranges, and were also historically very rare in the state of Massachusetts, which we can look at through another citizen science effort, the Massachusetts Butterfly Atlas, where they did a very careful survey using the model of the Audubon Society. And we can see that there's this cluster of butterflies that has sort of moved into the state from the south. And the overall community interpretation of this is a community-wide range shift of the entire butterfly community northward in the eastern US. Similarly, we can look at some other life history traits. And what we see here in this case is how the butterflies, what life history stage they overwintered as. In this case, eggs and unfed neonates, I've highlighted, are highly overrepresented in the declining species. And this is probably due to things like changes in snow cover, because one of the things that kills butterflies that overwinter is when it gets too dry, and the snow cover causes a very nice climate homogenization where you're cool and humid all winter long, but if that's gone, you can dry out and have these huge temperature swings through the winter, and you have much higher mortality. So we have this overall impression from the citizen science data that we just let them, that we sort of just left the community to collect without much scientific oversight, that we have a really strong climate signal in the butterfly population in the eastern US. So that's one little state that did things properly through time. Now, a little bit of oversight and sort of inspiration can go a long way in terms of getting the effort control and enthusiasm and the participation rates up in these people who are otherwise going out and looking at butterflies anyway. Just to report their observations online. And what the internet revolution is really making this easy, because you can just go online, and if you can make reporting your observations as easy as posting on Facebook, you're golden. You know, people are just going to do it, especially if you provide feedback about how awesome that is. And the other thing that you can really engage is these groups are often very competitive with each other. And if people are looking to be the person who found the most species that day, and if you can, in real time, get those observations up online so everyone else can see them, you'll do two things. You'll engage people to sort of compete with each other, but also when somebody finds a rare butterfly or rare bird, they will be more encouraged to go look for the species and just generally be outside observing things in the wild. And even if they don't find the thing that was reported last week on e-butterfly or e-bird, they will have made all these other observations. So one of the other things I wanted to mention was we have just lost, and I was not aware of this, but there was a citizen science group in Alaska, the Alaska Lepidoptera Survey, that was run by Ken Phillips, who was organizing a network of volunteers for 44 years. And he had amassed, I think, 600 volunteers. They weren't all concurrently active, but he managed to engage these people with just the right tone, because he was really an enthusiast. So he was crossing the line. He was actually a physicist by training, and then moved to Alaska and did butterflies. So he understood butterfly enthusiasts and what actually drove them, because he was totally one. And he managed to get people to send in 80,000 specimens and contribute hundreds of thousands of records, which we now have to curate. And he actually recorded a lot of this stuff, but he fortunately died in March. And so we're trying to rebuild this, and what we would really like to do is make this part of eButterfly. But we have this network of volunteers that we are trying to engage in this incredibly large place where you have to fly on an airplane to get to see your buddy. But he did this, and me and another fellow, Derek Sykes, who's the curator of the Museum of the North, are really trying to rebuild this program or keep it going. So we've got quite a bit of work to do. I'm just going to mention briefly this other aspect of contributing to citizen science. And again, this is another list length thing, or list observation method, a bit more structured. The breeding bird surveys are actually quite structured. They have very regular points, but a network of volunteers nonetheless are running it. The problem with these volunteers is they're generally getting older. We're not recruiting younger people in as much, and they're getting deafer, which is a problem if your observation methods are reliant on auditory detections. But it turns out if you record the ages, so there's actually two places where people lose their hearing. There's the notch, which is between 3 and 6 kilohertz, which is just overuse of those cells, which were basically destruction due to loud noises, and that's going to vary by individual. And then everyone loses their high-pitched hearing as they get older, no matter how much exposure they've had to sound. But that one's a very predictable loss. So you can use ages. I'm just going to skip through because I've only got a few minutes left. This is the change in detectability that Dr. Bob Farmer estimated in a paper that he just published this year, when he compared, on average, observers that were less than 40 to observers that were over 50. And what you see here is at the very highest end of the songs out here, particularly with species that have a very monotone pitch, like the blackpoll warbler and the golden crowned kinglet, you have a really rapid decline in detectability for more aged observers. And it turns out that the decline in the observed declines, in both the USGS breeding bird survey on the right here, on upper panel, and the The Canadian Wildlife Service matches very well, the pitches of the songs match very well of the birds that are, of the population trends of the birds match very well the pattern of human hearing loss as you get older. So it's very easy to correct this. You can actually take this curve here and simply use it to correct the abundance estimates. But this, by and large, hasn't been done yet. One of the reasons is the age of the volunteers hasn't actually been kept in the records very well. So Bob actually had to estimate, based on how long they were in the breeding bird survey, how old these people were. So the ages that he used were sort of best guesses. So I think that's where I'll leave it. I will just mention a few things. What you need to really do in any citizen science design is think about what you want to ask of your observers so that you keep them engaged but not overworked. Because if you take their agency away, you lose 90% of your potential observers, and even though the observers that you have left will be a little more perfect, the loss of statistical power is actually not worth it, in my opinion. Think about how to handle effort in your statistical analysis as well as in your protocols, because it's often easier than you think to handle effort control in the analysis side, even when it wasn't perfectly done in the field. And also think about the ability of your observers, particularly as they age, but there's all kinds of other ways. There are, of course, all kinds of different types of ability issues in citizen science data, particularly novices and younger people who are just coming in who don't have the familiarity with the species that they're trying to report. The solutions might be a lot easier than you think. And I'll leave that.
Wonderful, thank you.